Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Chris Hattingh. Chris, how are you doing?
Hi, Nick and Gabriel. Doing well, thanks. Trying to find a spot in Johannesburg to record this from, so I'm holding thumbs for the next half an hour. Holding fingers. Why does one say holding thumbs? Holding fingers.
The eternal quest for electricity. And of course, we also have Mr. Gabriel Crouse, who has a bit of a cough, but is still bravely joining us to share his wisdom and insight. So, Gabriel, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nicholas. How's it? How's it, Chris?
All right. So let's kick off with our first story. It was announced by Health Minister Joe Phaahla. Sorry. I flubbed that one.
It's not a hard name, Joe Phaahla.
No, I know. I just, every time I see all the A's and the H's, I trip over myself. But he has said that we are now entering...
of a show, Nicholas. You have to say people's names properly.
Yes, I'm kidding. He told the media that last week that there was a big spike in COVID-19 infections, and we are now entering a fifth wave. And I saw some media commentary saying it was earlier than expected. But we're living in a very different world from the world we were living in 2020. There is widely available effective vaccine. There are even some medications, I believe, now available, which can reduce the chance of hospitalization to almost nothing. And of course, we have enormous amounts of natural protection from the virus due to the enormous number of infections that we've experienced in South Africa. So the question is, and this goes to you, Gabriel, and of course, we also have, I think, the 30-day period after the announcement of the end of the state of disaster is either today or tomorrow, is about to expire. The question, I guess, is what does it mean to be in a fifth wave of COVID right now? What do you make of this, Gabriel?
Right. So let's start out with the really important question, which is, do you still have to wear masks? Do you still have to present a vaccine pass if you want to go to an outdoor event? Are business capacity limitations still at 50%? And you mentioned 30 days. Somehow there's this meme out there that what happened is the state of disaster was declared to be over. And then there was 30 days of this lockdown continuing under the state of disaster. And then I think everyone on this channel knows that then the idea is for Joe Phahla's regulations to step in and make the lockdown measures permanent after those 30 days are up. And because the state of disaster ended on April 4th, and we entered post-disaster lockdown on April 5th, it feels like 30 days has already passed. Today is the 31st day, something like that. And so we had some colleagues on the list saying, can you go to the Woolworths and just, like, if someone says you have to wear a mask, say, no, I don't. Check out the regulations. Here's the problem. The 30 days thing is a meme without a basis. The Disaster Management Act regulations say a month. That after a month, the lockdown automatically, a month after the disaster ends, all of the lockdown measures that were under the Disaster Management Act dissolve. But a month is a more flexible thing than 30 days. So from April 5th to May 5th is a month. And I think the way things are working out, that means that tomorrow Joe Phaahla will put in the health regulations to make this permanent. It's already confusing. Tomorrow it already feels confusing. Tomorrow there's like, maybe the month has already passed because it started at midnight between April 4th and April 5th. So it feels like it should end at midnight between May 4th and May 5th, which is midnight tonight. But I think that extra 24 hours is going to be used to its fullest interpretive extension effect of the English language and the law and the calendar. In other words, if by the end of tomorrow they haven't put in the new regulations, then all of the lockdown stuff really will have lapsed, and then you can go out and do what you want. And if someone says you can't do it, it's against the law, you can refer them to Gabriel Crouse, or more seriously to the Disaster Management Act regulations published on March 15th, 2022, which clearly states that there's only a month that they are applicable. I mean, other than that, what is there really to say? There's an interesting question, I suppose, about whether the deadly respiratory viral season that we have every winter and have had every winter on record is going to be predominantly COVID-19 oriented, or whether it's going to be predominantly influenza oriented, or whether it's going to be half and half or some other ratio like that. I don't think anyone really knows. The COVID-19 numbers have been extremely low, and then they climbed up a couple of weeks ago, and then they spiked, and then they came down. We're actually sort of on a mini dip. The numbers are so small. If you compare yesterday and the day before to the days before that, we're sort of like at the 2 weeks ago period rather than at the 5 days ago period. So I don't think that this is a cresting of a wave. I do think that it's likely that the numbers will come back up, but the point is the numbers are so small that it's quite noisy. That not every directional move gives you a full sense of a trend. We're going to need more time to see what the genuine trends are. What appears to be pretty clear is that whatever cardinal mutations there are in new variants of interest, not yet designated a variant of concern internationally, they show the same kinds of evolutionary patterns that Omicron showed in direction of change, which is to say that the huge divergence in deaths and cases that we saw in the fourth wave seems unlikely to be reversed. And I guess from a health perspective, that's going to matter to a lot of people.
Chris, your thoughts? I think that it wouldn't be entirely unusual for the government to sort of throw the regulations in quite late in the day. I think we've seen that before, where there seems to be furious negotiations about what exactly to do until the last minute. What do you make of the fifth wave prospects?
I'm sure government gave as much consideration to all the submissions and comments as they did, for example, to the 18th Constitution Amendment Bill, just to use one example. I suppose government will always want to be seen to be doing something for people when there's something like when there's a deadly virus going around. But at this point in time, maybe one should really make the case that active citizenship and responsibility should take preference. So if you are in a position where you feel comfortable taking the vaccine, then you should. If you want to wear a mask, you should continue washing your hands, that sort of stuff. It shouldn't be up to a minister to have the powers that the health regulation changes and amendments would give him to have that power to decide that another state of disaster is needed or other regulations or anything like that. So I do think the burden of proof on the state is way too large at this point in time after 2 years of COVID-19. Someone like Shapi Ahmadi, very well-respected scientist, has pointed to just how much infections have ravaged South Africa and what the actual use of lockdowns are, for example, just to use one sort of point of that. So you wonder now what permutations and what sort of what will be in the new regulations and how these will manifest. But I do feel like South Africans in general are pretty much, tired of COVID. Maybe bigger.
Can I put up my hand to say we know what's in the new regulations, and there's no, as far as I can tell, room for negotiation or debate. The regulations that are going to be put into effect, they've been published, they've been receipts of public comment, but it's basically they get implemented or they get tossed out. And if they get implemented, what they do is they say mask mandates indoors forever, as long as there is measles, tuberculosis, coronavirus, or novel influenza A, you need a mask indoors. They say that you need business capacity restrictions as long as there is a COVID-19 pandemic, which will be forever, according to some scientists, because as long as there's COVID, they'll call it a pandemic. And even without and those are 50% capacity restrictions. If the pandemic predicate is dropped, then it becomes business restrictions that are sort of listed as the outcomes that government wants without having detailed inputs, which is discretionary enough that it can be abused by any inspector. There's the vaccine pass, which says if you want to attend a large outdoor event, you have to present evidence that you've been vaccinated, or else present evidence of a test that's negative. And that's going to be for every rugby match, soccer match, cricket match, stadium event that you can imagine. And that's, again, in perpetuity. So those are the regulations. That is what is going to happen. It's just a matter of whether Patla signs that in, Minister Patla signs that in at midnight tonight or at 4 p.m. tomorrow, or whether he kind of misses the boat and then signs it in on Friday, in which case there will have been a sort of, 12-hour window in which South Africans could have quickly gone to the stadium and where people could have quickly made some money. But I don't think anyone's going to be fast enough for that. And I think that there's there might be a little bit of a sort of cynical government ploy to see if they can draw people out into slightly outrageous behavior. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think what's going to happen is what's already been written, and it's just is worth talking about, because those regulations are directly connected to 1.9 million jobs that have not yet come back. I keep sifting through the numbers, looking for another country that has performed as badly as South Africa, and not finding anything to compare it with. Our jobs numbers are just off the wall. It's amazing. I mean, we started out with the worst unemployment in the world outside of Zimbabwe and some small little island, former colony of the Brits that I can't remember. But it had a population of less than 500,000 people. So I don't think it really counts. And its last survey was in 2013. Okay, so other than that little technicality in Zimbabwe, we had the worst unemployment in the world. And then we made it worse. And it's going to continue being really, really, really bad as long as business is getting the signal that capacity limitations of 50% could be around forever. As long as every tourist kind of attraction thing has got a sort of Damocles hanging over its head, and as long as every domestic South African has stadiums barred to us, it sends such a depressing signal throughout the market that it irritates me profoundly. That what we're going to do instead, for the most part, of challenging this ongoing hypocrisy is we will continue living our lives outside of the rules, which is so easy to do. Most people I know who don't like these regulations, they just break the rules. But that's not a possibility for business. There's, ultimately the last thing being locked down in South Africa is money and jobs, and that's where we remain.
Well said. All right, I think let's move on to our next story now, and this comes from Mpumalanga, with the Mpumalanga Provincial Tourism and Parks Agency has, according to the Daily Maverick, abruptly changed its annual permit system for trout fishing. So my family was quite a fan of trout fishing for a while. There's all those towns: Belfast, Dullstroom, Leidenburg, Machadodorp. I think it's called the official name for the tourism region is, I think, something like the Cultural Heartland or the Highlands Meander. Anyway, sounds great. And trout fishing and tourism associated with that, so people going away to visit like a farm and then they fish in the rivers or on a dam for some trout for the weekend, has been the bedrock of the tourism industry in those areas. Indeed, it's possibly one of the reasons why a town like Dullstroom looks a lot better than a lot of the small towns around South Africa, which generally are quite bleak places. And yet, the Mpumalanga Tourism and Parks Agency has now decided that no, it's not good enough to simply get a permit to go trout fishing every year that needs to be renewed. You now have to do it every month. Now, I think anyone who's interacted with government knows very well that this is, shall we say, quite the burden and quite the cost. And apparently, according to people in the trout fishing industry, so that's people who run the guest farms and the places where you can go fish, as well as people who breed the fish to sell to these places, because trout can't naturally grow in a dam. They need running water, and so they often need to constantly resupply them. There's quite a big industry in just growing the fish in hatcheries. According to people in the industry, about 50% of the whole industry now may effectively be illegal because of this incredible change to the permitting system, and that there was basically no consultation from the Mpumalanga government. This just sounds completely and utterly crazy to me. And the Daily Maverick story goes on to talk about how, you know, a significant number of people get their livelihoods and their jobs from these industries, and how it employs a range of people from sort of people who do fish biology, hatchery science stuff, to people who, you know, clean up farm, you know, guest houses, that kind of thing. Anyway, there appears to be an attempt to push back in the courts, and one-time guest of the show, Richard Spoor, is actually acting on behalf of the Northern Trout Association in opposing this change. But Chris, it's just it just when you sent me the story, I actually swore immediately it was like a sort of gut reaction, because it just seems so thick. I mean, why would they do this?
But yeah, well, maybe the 64% unemployment rate on the expanded definition isn't high enough for some in government. Maybe those are rookie numbers, and we need to push those numbers up even more, so we force some trout farmers also into dependence on the state. I suppose this, you know, one can. There are obviously more than two explanations, but two of the ones top of mind. One is just maliciousness, but the other could just be death by bureaucracy and red tape, where maybe someone was worried about, I don't know, the stock of trout in Mpumalanga or other environmental concerns, and they felt that they had to act again and help and save the trout and sort of intervene in that way, but there wasn't really proper consultation and taking cognizance of unintended consequences. Makes me think of, I mean, what Frederick Bastiat would have said about the law of unintended consequences, where even though it might be well-intentioned, it still has effects downstream, pardon the pun, but that you might not plan for when you sit and draft the law in Pretoria or Bloemfontein or Cape Town, for example. You don't take cognizance of what's actually happening and what effects this might have on people actually working in these various value chains and supply chains. So yeah, very, very sad for that industry in that province. But hopefully the pushback is effective, and it makes some bureaucrats and politicians realize just some of the unintended consequences of their actions.
So, Gabriel, one of the things that always concerns me about this kind of about permitting systems in general, particularly in South Africa, is the opportunity for extortion. I can very easily now see sort of trout farmers and guest house owners having inspectors turn up at their property and say, "Oh, it looks like you're 3 days late for renewing your trout license, but you know, maybe a bottle of whiskey would make me look the other way." What do you make of this regulation change?
Yeah, I mean, to go back a little bit to the fool knave question, there's always this problem when a human being acts badly. Is it because they're being foolish or malevolent deliberately? I do lean more towards the knavish answer than the foolish answer on trout, because since I started covering the agricultural sector in 2018, just about the most stupid regulations and laws that have been proposed in that whole sector have been targeted at the trout industry. So, I mean, the overarching story the whole time has been expropriation without compensation, and we still have the expropriation bill and the land courts bill, which together will, you know, try and achieve what the amendment to the Constitution failed to do, given that the Constitution didn't get changed. So there's always been this big attack, but there's underneath that constantly been this sort of niggling at the trout industry. At one stage, for example, a regulation purported effectively to make the transport of fingerlings impossible. So all of those hatcheries, the only way to restock new dams was basically made kind of a priori something that you're not allowed to do. And that had to be challenged and had to be struck down. And in the meanwhile, it had to be circumvented. And as far as I know, and I wouldn't like to name any sources, in the meanwhile, there has been some brown envelopes that have had to change hands. And I think that this speaks to this the same point as in the first segment, where there is this unfortunate thing that politicians in South Africa are increasingly managing to pull off, which is to criminalize all of us, right? The one thing that we have over most of our most famous politicians is that I do not live off stolen money. I have not personally stolen lots and lots of poor people's money in order to buy a fancy German sports car and have holidays in Dubai. But as more and more bad and stupid laws get passed, it becomes increasingly difficult to stay on the right side of the law. And I think that there is certainly, whether it's strategic or not, there is a long-term benefit to be had for politicians that are crooks. If you're running a criminal syndicate and calling it a country, you want everyone else to become a criminal too, because it takes away the difference between yourself and the population, and it therefore secures your position. So yes, when I see a bad law like this, I don't assume that it's a foolish politician in Pretoria who just didn't see the downstream consequences. I think it's much more likely that there's someone who knows that this will open incentives for graft, that will take, community leaders, business leaders that have large amounts of staff that are kind of looked up to, and change how they are perceived in their communities, because it'll be an open secret that they are paying bribes to government. And then we're all pigs in the muck, and that kind of makes every anti-corruption argument made on a political soapbox seem more hypocritical, and keeps power in the hands of the incumbent, as well as a bit of extra cash.
Not to go too much on the tangent here, but Gabriel, I really like that point, and I think it actually dovetails with that great video that you did on Freedom Day last week, where you talked to a couple of unemployed people around South Africa and asked them questions. And one of the guys said, look, I didn't vote because, everyone is, there's no government I can trust and it's all useless and pointless. And there was a sort of deep cynicism, this feeling of kind of sort of total hopelessness that at least came out to me in that video. And I recommend you all go check it out on YouTube.
Thank you. I'll just say, that guy off camera, our cameraman had shifted to something else, but he continued to say, he said, the only way I will ever vote is if a politician comes to pay me personally.
Right. And I think what you're talking about here, about this sort of, spreading the corruption around, what it does is it breeds that kind of cynicism. When everyone is a hypocrite, you kind of just feel, what's the point? And that allows the status quo to remain in place. And I will post the link to that video in the pinned comments underneath this video after the show. Okay, Chris, in 2 minutes, any final thoughts?
No, but I think Gabriel is exactly right. I need to go back to it. I was supposed to write an article on this for a while now, but there's a crony capitalism index published by The Economist, and I'm sure that we rank relatively high, not as high as somewhere like Russia, for example, but that sort of idea of the only way to get ahead is by who you know and who you can buy and who you can influence. So I think Gabriel's exactly right.
All right. Now for our last story. Yesterday, we actually had an internal discussion on marijuana legalization. And we've heard quite a lot about marijuana legalization recently. Government has, I believe in the State of the Nation, President Cyril Ramaphosa talked about expanding the cannabis industry. And now the Hattingh government has announced last week, that they are interested in getting proposals from entrepreneurs to be part of the Gauteng Cannabis Industrialization Program. This program, which is led by the Gauteng Department of Economic Development and the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, is part of a goal, the province's goal to create jobs and boost the economy by processing hemp and cannabis at an industrial scale. Some government requirements for those applying are that their proposals include funding mechanisms, cannabis-driven carbon reduction, rehabilitation of compromised mining land, and inclusion of communities as partners. A couple of things to talk about here. One of them is that this, once again, a lot of government policies have this problem where they sort of try to do everything at once. Like a mining policy, it'll say, not only are we going to put the mine and are we going to do an environmental impact assessment, but also we're going to make sure the mine has a plan to fix the local reservoir or something like that. And the whole thing becomes this massive burden where you're trying to solve 17 problems with one policy. Gabriel, it's a bit weird, this, to me, because cannabis is still sitting in a little bit of a illegal space, or a sort of semi-legal space, is it
In
not?
a
Especially
haze.
when it comes to yes, indeed, in a haze.
So there really is, it's just amazing. The Constitutional Court back in 2018, I think it was, said the laws prohibiting consumption, personal recreational consumption and ownership, they violate your privacy. And so kind of in a pretty libertarian way, the court said, you know, you can put whatever you want into your body, and that's going to be our argument. So you can have 2 plants and you can consume it yourself. And Parliament now needs to go and make a law to address that. It's 4 years later. Parliament still hasn't passed that law, but it did publish one version of it last year, which really did exactly what the court had already done. It basically just took the court's judgment and kind of wrote it out as a law. Then someone complained, and an amazing move is made where they've, in the new draft amendment, which was approved in April just before Parliament took its sort of little mini vacation, that says, there's a section that says more or less, you know, the sale of marijuana, of cannabis, is hereby authorized, provided that there is some legislation to authorize the sale of cannabis. And then, like, subsection 2, without getting in the way of subsection 1, will say other things about how the sale can go forward. And then elsewhere in the legislation, it still refers to, you know, things that you can do, ways that you can provide or supply cannabis that don't make allowance for exchange of remuneration or exchange of consideration, where exchange of consideration is basically like payment in money or payment in kind. So the law, as it's currently being pushed forward, looks a little bit like it was written by a stoned, 21-year-old law student who was like, you can sell it, but you can't sell it. That's weird. Well, I guess that's what it is. Okay. I'm very sorry to report that that is the fact. And I'm sure that what will happen is that it'll be, if it's passed as it is, if we're not able to clarify it, which you're aiming to do, it's going to be passed in a confusing way, and that's going to create opportunity for more court challenges and for more basically bribery and corruption, where people just pay money to, leave me alone. And for the main part of the industry that's legitimate and above board to remain in the medical sector, exporting overseas or to domestic medical marijuana markets, and that's all fine. But the problem with it is that because we're going in this very slow purple haze kind of goofy way, the rest of the world is continuing to find better ways of adding value to these products, of trading them around, of tapping into new supply chains, doing this in ways that are sophisticated enough that they're not increasing ordinary consumption amongst teenagers that are then going to get depressed and drop out of school, trying to keep it smart and above board. We're just being left behind by countries like Lesotho. And so the promises I've heard from Ramaphosa of like 130,000 jobs out of this, I mean, I think that's too much, even if we did the best that we possibly could. But I think this master plan from Gauteng is just a perfect example of what's going to take so long to think out that it's never actually going to be implemented in a way that adds an actual job to a real person in South Africa.
Chris, in 30 seconds, I almost foresee a terrible future where government is illegally growing and selling cannabis, but ordinary sort of private businesses are being still harassed by the police about it. What do you make of this?
Yeah, government wants to re-up South Africa's industrialization and manufacturing capacity through master plans. So why not do it with the cannabis industry as well? I think it's perfectly consistent with the ideal and the practical implication. But yeah, nothing. I think Gabriel has summed it up exactly correctly and very effectively. So nothing of substance to add, really.
Okay. All right. That's all the time we have for today. I just like to remind everyone to please go to the irr.org.za and click the Join Us button to sign up as a friend of the Institute of Race Relations to support us in our endeavors to change the policy landscape in South Africa. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and we hope that you have a most excellent and wonderful day. We will see you tomorrow. Cheers, everyone.